It's a strange thing, isn't it? How convinced we can be of our own righteousness even when the evidence screams otherwise. How we build elaborate mental castles, fortifying them with logic and indignation to justify actions that, from any objective standpoint, are pure self-sabotage, or worse, sabotage directed at those we claim to love. You see it time and again on the show. People walk in, shoulders squared, a certain glint in their eyes that says, I'm here to tell my side, and you're going to see I'm right. But my job, my true calling, is to look past the performance, past the well-rehearsed lines, and ask, what's really going on here? I had a woman on the show not too long ago, let's call her Sarah, though that's not her real name. She was absolutely certain she was in the right when she set out to dismantle her own sister's wedding. That's right, her sister, her own flesh and blood. Now, when I say dismantle, I don't mean a snide comment at the rehearsal dinner or a drunken toast. I mean a deliberate, calculated campaign to undermine, embarrass, and ultimately destroy the happiest day of her sister's life. When Sarah first came onto the stage, she carried herself with a peculiar mix of defiance and self-pity. Not defiance born of strength, mind you, but the brittle kind that comes from a desperate need to maintain a narrative, a story she told herself so many times it had become her gospel. She sat down, crossed her arms, and looked out at the audience with an expression that dared anyone to judge her. The producers had already given me the rundown, naturally. Sister sabotaged wedding, jealousy, attention-seeking. These were the easy labels, the quick summaries that the outside world, and often the family itself, slapped on such a situation. But in my line of work, easy and quick rarely lead to the truth. My initial impression of Sarah wasn't that she was simply a bad person or malicious. Those terms are too simplistic, too black and white, and they fail to account for the complex, often contradictory motivations that drive human behavior. What I saw was someone deeply entrenched in their own pain, a pain so profound and so unaddressed that it had metastasized into resentment and destructive action. She wasn't just doing something, she was acting out something. The wedding, her sister, the entire celebratory event, they weren't the targets themselves, but rather the convenient stage for a much older, much more deeply rooted drama. She started her account with a litany of grievances, each one carefully curated, each delivered with the conviction of someone who believes they've been grievously wronged. My sister, she's always been the favorite, she'd say, her voice tight, a slight tremble betraying the outward composure. Everything just falls into her lap. She never had to work for anything. And this wedding, it was just another example. Another grand spectacle where she got to be the princess and I was just there. It was a classic setup, sibling rivalry, the perennial favorite child narrative. But what struck me wasn't the claim itself, but the intensity of the emotion behind it. It wasn't just a statement of fact, it was a wound festering for years, perhaps decades. When she spoke about the wedding preparations, about her sister's excitement, there was a thinly veiled contempt that hinted at something far more corrosive than simple envy. It was almost as if she felt her sister's happiness was a direct affront to her own existence, a personal insult designed specifically to highlight her perceived inadequacies. I listened patiently, as I always do. I let her tell her story uninterrupted, allowing her to lay out her justifications, her reasoning, her blueprint for why her actions were not only understandable, but in her mind, entirely warranted. She described how she had deliberately spread rumors about the groom, fabricated a story about the caterer having food poisoning, even went so far as to subtly misplace key vendor contracts. Each detail was delivered with a strange blend of pride and victimhood. She was proud of her cleverness, her ability to execute her plan, but simultaneously felt victimized by the circumstances that, in her view, necessitated such extreme measures. Her focus was entirely external. What her sister did, what her parents did, what life had given or denied her. There was no internal reflection, no sense of personal accountability. It was all because she's always the golden child, because no one ever paid attention to me, because they just expected me to be happy for her. It was a classic projection, a refusal to look inward, to examine the true source of her discontent. She was trapped in a loop of blame, and that loop was dictating her life, her relationships, and now her sister's wedding. I knew right then that peeling back these layers wasn't going to be a gentle conversation. It was going to be an excavation of the core belief that justified such destructive behavior, and an exploration of the pain that fueled it. The question wasn't if she was wrong, the question was why she couldn't see it. And that, right there, was the central problem I had to help her confront. When you hear someone repeatedly use phrases like, always the favorite, or never had to work for anything, it's not just a casual observation, it's a deeply ingrained belief, a narrative that has been etched into their psyche over years, often decades. For Sarah, this wasn't just about her sister's wedding. This was about every perceived slight, every perceived victory her sister had ever achieved, accumulating into a mountain of resentment that she carried everywhere. She saw her sister's joy, her success, her impending marriage, not as individual events, but as further proof, further reinforcement of the core belief that she was somehow less, somehow unworthy. I started to probe gently, taking her back, asking about her childhood. Sarah, I began, my voice even, you mentioned your sister was always the favorite. Can you tell me what that looked like growing up? Give me some examples. What did you see? What did you feel? What did you experience that led you to that conclusion? She didn't hesitate. The stories came flooding out, each one a tiny brick in the wall she had built around her hurt. Well, for starters, when we were kids, if my sister cried, my mom would rush over, always. She'd get picked up, comforted. If I cried, it was always, Sarah, toughen up, don't be such a baby. Or, your sister's upset, you need to be strong for her. It was always about catering to her emotional needs. Never mind. She recounted holidays where her sister's gifts were always bigger or better, even if they were just different. School achievements. She got good grades without even trying, and my parents would gush. I had to study for hours, and if I got an A, it was just expected. If I got a B, it was what happened, Sarah. It was a classic pattern. Not necessarily that the parents intentionally favored one child over the other in a malicious way, but often parenting styles or a child's inherent temperament can lead to vastly different experiences of validation and attention. Perhaps the sister was more outwardly expressive, or perhaps more fragile in her early years, prompting a different parental response. Or perhaps Sarah's perception was colored by her own developing insecurities, leading her to interpret benign interactions through a lens of unfairness. This is crucial to understand. Perception becomes reality, especially in the formative years. If a child perceives they are less loved, less seen, less valued, that perception shapes their entire worldview, regardless of the parent's true intentions. What I observed with Sarah was a deep-seated feeling of emotional neglect, masked by a veneer of righteous anger. It wasn't just about the things her sister received, but the emotional validation, the feeling of being chosen, seen, heard. Sarah felt like she was constantly vying for a spot that was already taken, a race she was destined to lose before it even began. This created a profound sense of insecurity and an insatiable need for recognition. When you don't get that recognition in healthy ways, you often start seeking it in unhealthy ways. The dramatic, destructive act of sabotaging a wedding becomes, in this twisted logic, a desperate plea for attention. Look at me! I matter! Even if it's for something negative, at least you're looking. I noted how she consistently framed her sister as an antagonist, a rival, rather than a sibling. Their relationship wasn't built on shared experiences and affection, but on a tally sheet of who got what, who was praised more, who was loved more. This competitive dynamic wasn't necessarily started by her sister. It was often initiated and perpetuated by Sarah's own internal narrative. Her sister, in Sarah's mind, became a symbol of everything Sarah felt she was denied. I could see the emotional scars, the way her eyes would dart away when I mentioned her parents' involvement, then quickly snap back with a hardened gaze, ready to defend her position. The slight tension in her jaw whenever she spoke about her sister's successes, these weren't just surface-level reactions. They were physical manifestations of decades of suppressed pain and unaddressed emotional needs. She was living out a childhood script, and that script was directing her adult life, sabotaging her relationships, and preventing her from finding genuine happiness. The pattern was clear. Anytime her sister achieved something significant, it triggered Sarah's deeply rooted feelings of inadequacy and resentment. The wedding, therefore, wasn't just a trigger. It was the ultimate, grandest trigger. It represented her sister's triumph in love, in partnership, in building her own family, all things Sarah perhaps felt she hadn't achieved or hadn't achieved with the same effortless grace she perceived in her sister. Her actions weren't just malicious, they were a desperate, misguided attempt to level the playing field, to disrupt the narrative where her sister always won and she always lost. She wasn't just trying to hurt her sister, she was trying to heal her own deep, unacknowledged wounds, albeit through profoundly destructive means. She was acting like a wounded child, lashing out, demanding to be seen, demanding her share of the spotlight, even if that spotlight was cast by the destructive flames of her own making. The question now was how to get her to see that the fire she was setting was burning her own life down too. The backstory was critical because it laid the groundwork for understanding why Sarah's actions escalated to such a destructive degree. It wasn't a spontaneous act of malice. It was the culmination of decades of unresolved feelings, culminating in a perfect storm around the wedding. The engagement itself was the first spark. Sarah described her initial reaction as annoyance. She called me all giddy talking about the ring, the proposal, and all I could think was, here we go again. Another thing she gets to brag about, another reason for everyone to dote on her. This wasn't just annoyance. It was a deeply personal affront. Every detail of the wedding planning became a new opportunity for her resentment to fester. The dress fittings, the venue choices, the guest list discussions, each step forward for her sister was perceived as a step backward for Sarah. She was just so happy, Sarah would say, a sneer in her voice, like she deserved all of it, like she was entitled to this perfect fairy tale wedding. This wasn't about the wedding per se, it was about the perception of her sister's entitlement to happiness, a happiness Sarah felt she herself had been denied. The escalation wasn't a single event, but a gradual, insidious process. It started subtly with passive-aggressive comments. Oh, that dress is interesting, or are you sure that caterer is within budget? The one with the bad reviews online. Then it became more direct, more overt. She began to actively undermine her sister's choices, spreading doubts to their parents, to other family members, even to the groom. I'd tell Mom, I heard this about the florist, or I saw the groom flirting with someone at the bar the other night. She was planting seeds of doubt, hoping to create discord. The family started to notice. Her parents, initially trying to mediate, found themselves caught in the crossfire. They'd say, "Sarah, why can't you just be happy for your sister?" she recounted, her voice rising in indignation. And I'd say, "Happy when she's always rubbing her perfect life in my face?" They just didn't get it. No one ever gets it. This is where the blame shifting became particularly pronounced. Sarah couldn't fathom that her actions were the problem. She saw herself as the victim, reacting justifiably to her sister's perceived provocations and the family's blind favoritism. The confrontations within the family became increasingly heated. There were shouting matches, accusations, tears. Her sister, initially trying to reach out to involve Sarah in the wedding planning, eventually pulled back hurt and confused. She said, "Sarah, why are you doing this to me? This is supposed to be the happiest time of my life." Sarah mimicked her sister's voice, a sarcastic edge to her tone, and I just laughed. "Happiest time? You haven't seen anything yet." That's when her actions became truly destructive. She described how she called the venue and tried to change the date, claiming her sister had authorized it. She sent anonymous emails to several guests detailing fabricated stories about the groom's past. She even, with disturbing meticulousness, attempted to tamper with the wedding cake order, trying to change the flavor to something she knew her sister hated and requesting a garish, inappropriate design. "I wanted to make sure everyone knew it wasn't perfect," she admitted, almost proudly, that no matter how hard she tried, it would never be as flawless as she thought it should be. This wasn't just about sabotaging a wedding, it was about destroying an image. Her sister's image of perfection, of effortless success, was what Sarah felt she needed to shatter. In her warped perspective, if her sister's wedding wasn't perfect, then her sister wasn't perfect, and perhaps, just perhaps, that would bring her sister down to Sarah's level. This was the core of her destructive behavior, a desperate attempt to equalize what she perceived as a fundamentally unfair balance in their lives. The family at this point was in crisis. The wedding was just weeks away, and the emotional toll on everyone was immense. Her sister was devastated, her parents heartbroken and frustrated. They had tried everything, reasoning, pleading, even threatening. But Sarah was unyielding, convinced she was the one being wrong, that her actions were merely consequences of a lifetime of being overlooked. She saw her sister's pain not as a result of her own actions, but as a confirmation of her sister's weakness, or perhaps as a justifiable payment for all the perceived slights. It became clear to the family that they couldn't resolve this on their own. The emotional wounds were too deep, the patterns too entrenched. They sought help, and that's how Sarah ended up on my stage. She didn't come willingly, mind you. She was pressured, almost dragged there, believing she was coming to expose her sister and set the record straight, to finally prove that she was the one who deserved sympathy, she was the one who had been wronged. But I knew, and she would soon find out, that the story she had been telling herself and everyone else was about to be challenged in a way she never anticipated. The truth, as it often does, was much more uncomfortable than her carefully constructed narrative. When it came time for the confrontation on stage, the air was thick with tension. Sarah sat opposite me, her arms still crossed, her gaze fixed, ready for battle. She had spent weeks, if not years, mentally rehearsing her arguments, her justifications. She had a story, and she was sticking to it. My job wasn't to argue with her story, but to unravel it, to find the truth buried underneath all the layers of hurt and resentment. I started by acknowledging her feelings, not validating her actions. "Sarah," I said, leaning forward, my voice calm but firm, "I hear you. I hear that you feel overlooked, that you felt like your sister has always had it easier, that she's always been the favorite. I understand that those feelings are very real for you and that they've caused you a lot of pain. No one is here to say your pain isn't real. This disarmed her slightly. She expected me to jump straight to judgment, to tell her how wrong she was, but I wanted her to feel heard, at least initially, to open a small crack in her emotional armor. However, I continued. What I also see is a lot of pain that you've inflicted, not just on your sister, but on your family, and ultimately on yourself. She bristled instantly. I've inflicted pain. What about all the pain she's inflicted on me? What about my parents always taking her side? She was back to her script, to the blame, to the external focus. Let's set aside for a moment what your sister did or didn't do, or what your parents did or didn't do, I said, cutting gently through her rising indignation. Let's talk about you. You chose to sabotage your sister's wedding. You chose to spread rumors, to try and change bookings, to create chaos. You chose to do these things. And I have to ask you, Sarah, genuinely from the bottom of your heart, what did you think that was going to accomplish for you? She paused. This was the moment. This was the question that started to chip away at her carefully constructed narrative. Most people, when faced with such an internal query, will resort to the external. I wanted her to feel what I felt, or I wanted them to see how much she was hurting me, and Sarah was no different. I wanted her to realize, she began, her voice still defensive, that she wasn't so perfect, that things don't always go her way. I wanted to get even, I guess. For all the years she walked all over me, for all the attention she got, okay, I acknowledged you wanted to get even. You wanted to burst her bubble. You wanted her to feel pain, to experience imperfection. Let's say you succeeded. Let's say the wedding was an absolute disaster, a complete humiliation for her. What happens then, Sarah? Do you suddenly feel loved? Do you feel seen by your parents? Does your internal pain just magically disappear because your sister is hurting? This was the core of it. This was the question that exposed everything. She blinked. Her eyes, which had been so hard, so resolute, softened ever so slightly. The bravado began to falter. She hadn't considered the outcome beyond the immediate gratification of revenge. She hadn't considered that her sister's misery wouldn't fill the gaping hole inside her own heart. She hadn't considered that destroying someone else's happiness doesn't magically create your own I don't know. She mumbled, almost to herself. It was the first time I heard genuine uncertainty in her voice. The first time her narrative cracked, I guess. I guess not. No, you wouldn't, I affirmed. Because your pain isn't actually about your sister's success. Your pain is about your perception of your own worth, your perception of your place in your family. And no matter how much you try to tear down your sister, that perception won't change until you change it. All you've done is taken your pain, weaponized it, and thrown it at the people who, despite your current feelings, are still your family. I pressed further, gently but relentlessly. Think about it, Sarah. When you were spreading those rumors, when you were trying to mess with the contracts, when you were actively trying to ruin this day for your sister, what did you actually feel? Were you happy? Were you fulfilled? Or were you consumed by anger, by bitterness, by the very pain you claim your sister caused you? The dam began to break. Her eyes welled up, her shoulders slumped, the tightly crossed arms finally relaxed, her hands falling into her lap. I was miserable, she whispered, her voice cracking. I felt awful. But I just kept telling myself it was justified, that she deserved it, that I deserved to do it. And that's the lie you've been telling yourself. Sarah, I said, my voice softer now, more compassionate. That hurting someone else will heal you. It never does. It only leaves you with more pain and a trail of broken relationships. The person you've been hurting the most through all of this, believe it or not, is yourself. It was a tough truth, a bitter pill to swallow. But in that moment, for the first time, she wasn't fighting me. She wasn't fighting her sister. She was starting to confront the most difficult opponent of all, her own ingrained beliefs and the destructive patterns they had created. The breakthrough wasn't a sudden epiphany of joy. It was the raw, painful admission of her own misery and the dawning realization that her path of revenge was a dead-end street. The next step would be about guiding her toward a different direction, a path of healing, forgiveness, and ultimately self-acceptance. The aftermath of that confrontation was messy, as it often is. There were tears, apologies, and a long, difficult conversation with her sister, off camera. It wasn't a fairy tale ending where everything was magically resolved and the wedding went off without a hitch. The damage had been done and trust had been broken. The wedding did proceed, albeit with a different atmosphere. The joy was still there, but it was tempered with a palpable sense of caution and sadness. Sarah attended, but she was on the periphery, a silent observer rather than a participant. I'm told she tried to help, offering to assist with last-minute tasks, but her efforts were met with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. The sister was polite, even gracious, but the hurt was still raw, the question of whether genuine forgiveness was possible still hanging in the air. In the weeks that followed the show, I stayed in contact with Sarah, as I often do. She began therapy, a crucial step in addressing the underlying issues that fueled her destructive behavior. It was a slow, arduous process filled with setbacks and moments of doubt. She struggled to confront her feelings of inadequacy, to challenge the narrative of being the lesser sister. There were times she wanted to give up, to retreat back into her familiar patterns of blame and resentment. The real turning point, I believe, came when she started to focus on self-compassion. It's a concept many people struggle with, especially those who have a history of self-criticism and self-sabotage. I encouraged her to treat herself with the same kindness and understanding she would offer a friend in a similar situation, to acknowledge her pain, to validate her feelings without justifying her actions. This wasn't about excusing her behavior. It was about creating a space for healing, for breaking the cycle of self-loathing that had driven her to such extremes. She started small, with simple affirmations, with acts of self-care. She took up painting, something she enjoyed as a child but had abandoned years ago. She started volunteering at a local animal shelter, finding purpose and connection in caring for others. She began to challenge her negative self-talk, replacing judgmental thoughts with more compassionate ones. Instead of saying, "I'm such a failure," she started saying, "I'm struggling right now, but I'm doing my best." The relationship with her sister remained strained, but it slowly started to mend. There were no grand gestures of reconciliation, no dramatic declarations of love. It was a gradual process of rebuilding trust, of showing consistent effort, of demonstrating genuine remorse. Sarah started by apologizing sincerely and repeatedly for the pain she had caused. She didn't offer excuses or justifications. She simply acknowledged the harm she had done and expressed her deep regret. The sister, in turn, started to open up, sharing her own feelings of hurt and confusion. She admitted that she hadn't always been aware of Sarah's struggles, that she had been focused on her own life, perhaps to the detriment of their relationship. She acknowledged her own role in the dynamic, her own blind spots and oversights. It wasn't a perfect resolution, not by any means. There were still moments of tension, of awkwardness, of unspoken resentments. But there was also a growing sense of understanding, of empathy, and a willingness to move forward to create a new chapter in their relationship. Sarah will have to live with the consequences of her actions, and she knows that rebuilding the trust she broke will take time and consistent effort. Not every story ends with a happily ever after. Not every guest on my show experiences a complete transformation. But Sarah's story, I think, is a powerful reminder that even the most destructive behavior can be understood, and that even the deepest wounds can begin to heal. It's a testament to the power of self-awareness, of accountability, and of the human capacity for change. It's also a sobering example of how unchecked resentment and unresolved childhood wounds can poison relationships and lead to profound acts of self-sabotage disguised as righteous indignation. What I hope people take away from Sarah's story is that before you go pointing fingers, before you start justifying your actions by blaming others, take a hard look in the mirror and ask yourself, what am I really trying to accomplish here? And is this path truly leading me to the happiness I seek? Because sometimes the biggest obstacle to our own happiness isn't the people around us, but the stories we tell ourselves about them and the pain we refuse to confront within ourselves.